Friends, today's story centers around the suspect, Nicole Abusharif, and the victim, Rebecca Klein, which took place in Villa Park, Illinois. But before I get to the story, this is her interrogation. Look at all these CDs, right? If you look at the actual disc, you see the name, N. Abusharif. So I managed to get the interrogation, but none of these work, right? I don't know why. They're called WVR files or something. So if you guys know how to play this CD, DM me on Instagram, let me know. So then, I can post the interrogation for you as well. Now, the only way I can tell this story is to work backwards from the trial to the incident. Please note, in this video, I'll be referring to Nicole as the defendant, and I'll be referring to the victim, Rebecca, as the victim. On May the 5th, 2009, following a jury trial, the defendant, Nicole Abusharif, was convicted of first-degree murder of her girlfriend and housemate, Rebecca Klein. The trial court subsequently sentenced the defendant to 50 years in prison. On appeal, the defendant argued that the trial court erred in admitting evidence of both text and MySpace messages between the defendant and another woman, Rose Sodaro. The defendant also argued that the trial court abused its discretion in imposing a 50-year sentence. So clearly, the defendant wasn't happy about the evidence allowed. On March the 21st, 2007, the defendant was charged by complaint with first-degree murder and concealment of a homicidal death. On April the 12th, 2007, the defendant was indicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of concealment of a homicidal death. On March the 20th, 2009, Nicole filed a motion to prevent the state from preventing evidence of communications between Nicole and Sodaro while on MySpace. Nicole argued that any evidence of her lying to Sodaro on MySpace did not make it more or less likely that she committed the murder and was more prejudicial than probative. The state argued that the messages were relevant because they demonstrated the nature of the relationship between the defendant and Sodaro. The state intended to argue that the defendant had motive to murder the victim because their relationship had deteriorated and the defendant wanted to start a new life with Sodaro. So then on April the 9th, 2009, following a hearing, the trial court noted generally statements showing that a person wanted to end the relationship would be deemed relevant evidence of motive. So on April the 20th, the trial commenced. And just to summarize, the defendant argued, well, if you're going to use these messages on MySpace, etc., well, it's not really relevant. I don't want this to be able to be admitted into evidence. But the prosecution argued, hold on a minute, this incriminates you. So it was allowed. At trial, Melanie Baldridge testified that she was the victim's sister. Nicole was the victim's partner and was treated as a member of the family. The victim and the defendant had lived together since 2001. The victim and Nicole had purchased the house in Villa Park and moved in about 9 months prior to the murder. In March 2002, the victim told Baldridge that she wanted to break up with Nicole. When the victim discussed the issue with Nicole, she threatened to drink herself to death. See the manipulation there? So because Nicole said, well, if you leave me, then I will take my own life, this forced Rebecca to stay with her. Baldridge testified that other than that incident, she was not aware of any other disagreements between the victim and the defendant. Baldridge further testified that on the evening on March the 15th, 2007, she was at the victim's house preparing the house for a family birthday. She arrived at 4:30 p.m. and she and the victim stopped to eat dinner around 6:15 p.m. The defendant was there, but was not helping with the party preparations. Baldridge left at 7:20 p.m. She called the victim at 8 p.m., but did not get an answer. The next morning, Friday, March the 16th, Baldridge did not hear from the victim as she normally did. She and the victim normally talked on the phone while on their way to work every morning. Just before lunch, Baldridge's mother called to say that no one had been able to reach the victim. Baldridge left work, picked up her husband, and went to the victim's house. When they arrived, Nicole was at the house, as well as police officers. Baldridge found the victim's cell phone on a window ledge in the basement. And on March the 17th, Baldridge learned that the police actually found Rebecca's body in Nicole's Mustang. It was in the trunk. John Lawler testified that he was the victim's boss. He had expected her at work on the morning of March the 16th, 2007. Around 11:30 a.m., he called the victim's house and spoke with Nicole. The defendant had told him that the victim had left for work that morning. Lawler told the defendant that he had not been able to reach the victim on her cell phone, and the defendant stated that the victim had been having trouble with her cell phone the last couple of days. Did you cause that trouble, Nicole? However, Lawler had spoken with the victim numerous times in the previous 2 days, and the victim did not mention any problems with her cell phone. Lawler testified that the victim drove a white van that belonged to their employer because her job involved the planning of recreational activities for disabled adults, and she often provided transportation to her clients. Rebecca Klein, the victim's mother, testified that the defendant had called her at 11:39 a.m. on Friday, March 16, 2007, to ask if she had heard from the victim. Nicole, the defendant, told Marilyn, the victim's mother, that she went to work and nobody else has been able to reach her. Marilyn called her husband and Baldridge to find out whether either of them had spoken with the victim, but neither had. She then called the defendant back to tell her that the family was worried because the victim had not called anyone and had not gone to work. The defendant said that she was going to drive around to see if she could find the victim's work van. At 1:15 p.m., the defendant called Marilyn to tell her that she had found the victim's van on the street around the corner from her house. Marilyn went to the victim's house at 2:50 p.m. The police and her husband were already there. The police wanted the defendant to accompany them to the bank to find out if there had been any unusual activity on the victim's bank accounts. Now, the defendant initially refused, citing, what if the victim calls? I want to be there. But then 20 minutes later, she said, okay, fine, I'll take you to the bank. On March 17, 2007, the police told the defendant that they wanted to search her house for clues. The defendant refused, but after the police persisted, she gave them consent to search. The day before, the defendant had readily consented to a search of the house and garage. After searching the house, on March the 17th, the police found the victim's body in the trunk of the Mustang in the garage. And what's also interesting is Marilyn, the mother, was aware that the victim wanted to have children, but the defendant did not, which could have caused friction in the relationship. But Marilyn did go on to say that she did not witness any major arguments between the victim and defendant. Now, Dave Subject testified that he was a Villa Park police officer. In response to a missing person report, he went to the defendant's home at around 2 p.m. The defendant stated that her girlfriend was missing. She stated that they did things around the house the night before and eventually went to bed. The defendant further stated that the victim had left the house for work at 6:30 a.m., the usual time she left for work. The defendant then went back to sleep and was awakened by a phone call at 11:37 a.m. from the victim's boss, who told the defendant that the victim had not shown up for work. The defendant told Officer Subject that she had found the victim's work van around the corner at about 1:30 p.m. She went to the vehicle and found the doors unlocked. On Friday, March 16, 2007, when everyone was at the victim's house, the police were trying to use the defendant's laptop computer, which was in the dining room. They were unable to connect to the internet, so Roger went downstairs to reset the wireless connection. However, the officer was still not able to make a connection. The computer showed that the wireless connection was working, then it went dead. Roger went back downstairs and saw that the modem had been unplugged. Roger further testified that when the defendant purchased the Mustang in 2005, she brought it over to his house. She showed him the inside of the trunk, and they discussed what sort of stereo equipment would fit in it. Rose Sodaro testified that she became acquainted with the defendant in March 2006 through MySpace. The defendant's MySpace name was called Hollywood. Given my skin tone, I guess my name would be Bollywood. Okay, poor joke, I know. Over a period of a month, they went from MySpace messaging to text messaging to speaking on the phone. Eventually, they met at Sodaro's house. They started out as friends, but eventually their relationship became sexual. So just to summarize, she's dating Rebecca, but then online she meets Sodaro, and now Nicole is having an affair. The defendant had showed Sodaro the Mustang numerous times, and Sodaro remembered seeing the defendant's guitar in the trunk on one occasion. Sodaro went to the defendant's house for the first time in June 2006 when the defendant lived in Lemont. The defendant told Sodaro that the defendant's brother bought the house so that the defendant could take care of him because he was dying of Wilson's disease. However, Nicole also claimed to Sodaro that she, Nicole, was also dying and was planning to move back to New York. The defendant told Sodaro that she and her alleged brother Danny had been firefighters at Station 67 in New York City. The defendant once told Sodaro that she also had Wilson's disease and was in the hospital for a liver transplant. Sodaro then asked her, "Oh yeah, so which hospital was it?" But Nicole would not tell her. Sodaro testified that she knew the stories about liver cancer were untrue. Why would she lie about that? What do you think the motivation would be? Sodaro went to a party at the defendant's neighbor's house in the summer of 2006. At some point, the two were in the defendant's house kissing. At some point thereafter, because Sodaro's mother did not approve of the defendant, Sodaro ended her relationship with the defendant. And given the nature of Nicole, bad move player. However, they started talking again in the fall of 2006. In early 2007, Sodaro received several text messages from the defendant. At that point, Sodaro began to feel suspicious of the defendant. On March 15, 2007, Sodaro invited the defendant to go bowling with her and some of her friends. The defendant invited Sodaro to her house, but Sodaro declined. They met at a restaurant at about 9:20 p.m. They left the defendant's car in the parking lot and drove to the bowling alley together in Sodaro's car. They arrived shortly before 10 p.m. The defendant drank shots and beers at the bowling alley. They left the bowling alley at 1:30 a.m. Because the defendant was intoxicated, Sodaro drove the defendant home. They arrived at the defendant's Villa Park home at 3 a.m. Sodaro parked her car in the driveway next to the front door. A white van was further up the driveway near the garage. Sodaro did not know whose van it was. There was no one else in the defendant's home. The defendant got clothes for Sodaro to sleep in. Sodaro saw that there was a gun in an open case on the bed. Sodaro had slept in the defendant's bed between 5 and 8 times. The victim was never there or in the house on each occasion. Sodaro did not know that the victim and the defendant were a couple. Sodaro testified that the defendant woke up between 7 and 8 a.m. Sodaro fell back asleep. When she woke up, she and the defendant watched television. After about 20 minutes, the defendant started getting phone calls that seemed to distress her. They left the house around noon to get the defendant's car from the restaurant parking lot. Before they left, the defendant told Sodaro that the victim was missing and that the victim's boss and father had called. As they were driving, the defendant made and received several more phone calls. Sodaro dropped the defendant off and then went home. She and the defendant were supposed to meet at 3:30 to attend a wake together. The defendant called her to tell her she would not be able to meet in time, but wanted Sodaro to wait for her because she wanted to come. As Sodaro was driving home from the wake, the defendant called her and told her that if she was pulled over by the police, she should deny knowing the defendant and deny having a MySpace account. Later, the defendant called to apologize that one of the neighbors had seen Sodaro's car in the defendant's driveway. She asked why that matters, but the defendant would not tell her. The defendant told Sodaro that if she was questioned by the police, she should say that she was out drinking with a friend on the night of March the 15th and left her car at the defendant's house because she could not drive. She told Sodaro, "I want you to say these things because I don't want you to get involved." Of course, Sodaro is confused. On Saturday, March the 17th, 2007, a police officer located Sodaro and brought her to the police station. Sodaro told the police what the defendant had told her to say. She told the police that she and the defendant were together on the night of March the 15th. She did not tell the police the nature of her relationship with the defendant because she was embarrassed. Text messages between the defendant and Sodaro were admitted into evidence. The state had filed a memorandum in support of admitting the text messages. In that memorandum, the state explained that its theory of the case was that the defendant and the victim were involved in a committed relationship similar to a marriage. They shared all their property and even insured each other with life insurance. And then a year prior to the murder, This is when the defendant found someone else, Sodaro. The state argued that the text messages showed that the defendant's relationship with Sodaro increased in intensity in the months just prior to the murder and that they provided motive for the murder. The state believed that the messages demonstrated the desperation of the defendant to win Sodaro's affection and the lengths she would go to ensnare, seduce, and keep Sodaro's affection. Is this why she told her she had cancer, transplant, or whatever it was? The state also argued that the subject text messages were relevant evidence of consciousness of guilt because the defendant had originally attempted to conceal her relationship with Sodaro. On April the 24th, 2009, the trial court determined that if the proper foundation was laid, the text messages were admissible. The trial court found that the messages set forth a pattern of communication between the defendant and Sodaro, showing that the defendant wanted to engender a relationship with Sodaro and provided a motive for the murder. The trial court further found that the fact that some of the messages were false corroborated the motive of the defendant. Specifically, the trial court stated that the fact that the defendant created elaborate stories as to why she was either unavailable or out of town corroborated the fact that she was attempting to develop a relationship with Sodaro, as well as conceal her relationships with the other from the victim and Sodaro. Therefore, upon questioning by the state, Sodaro testified as to each of the text messages and explained them in context. The defendant objected throughout this testimony and maintained that the messages were more prejudicial than probative. The text messages occurred between January the 29th and March the 15th, 2007. I could have showed you these text messages, but of course, these CDs don't work. The text messages contained various fictitious stories concerning the defendant's time as a New York and Villa Park firefighter, her fictitious brother Danny, who died of Wilson disease, and the defendant's liver cancer. Wow, imagine all of that being a lie. There were related messages about the defendant's tendency to get drunk in spite of her diseased liver. The defendant stated that she loved and needed Sodaro and that she wanted to get a new house so she and Sodaro and some of Sodaro's family could live together. The messages also showed that the defendant often presented herself as immediately unavailable to Sodaro because she was either out of town, at firefighter training, or on shift at the firehouse. On March the 15th, 2007, the text messages showed that the defendant was planning to go out with Sodaro that evening, but that she was on shift at the Villa Park firehouse and did not think she would get off until 7:30 p.m. Sodaro also testified concerning the MySpace postings that were submitted into evidence. The MySpace messages were sent to Sodaro from Sam, Tiff, Becky, and New York Fire Department. The state presented testimony that all the messages originated from IP addresses that were associated with the defendant, so she made all these accounts up. The messages showed that the defendant was creating the illusion that she was in high demand, that there were multiple people vying for her affection, and that she regularly had people hitting on her at the bar. Love, you're barely a 6. Come on. The transcript of the testimony regarding the text messages and MySpace messages exceeded 70 pages. Ralph Sajdock, one of the defendant's neighbors, testified that he had met Sodaro before and knew what her car looked like. He told the police that he had seen Sodaro's car in the defendant's driveway on the night of March the 15th, 2007. He woke up early on March the 16th and went to Dunkin' Donuts at 6:45 a.m. He returned at 7 a.m. and at that time, the victim's white van was parked in the driveway along with Sodaro's vehicle. The parties stipulated that representatives of the New York and Villa fire departments would testify that the defendant had never been employed as a firefighter in those cities, that a representative of American General Insurance Company would testify that the victim and the defendant were both insured with their company for $125,000, with each woman being the beneficiary of the other's policy, and that a member of Protective Life Corporation would testify that the victim was insured for $250,000 and that the defendant was the beneficiary of that policy. Now, you could argue that maybe Nicole did this to cash in on the life insurance policy. That point is unclear. At this point though, why did you lie about the firefighters? That's probably more concerning with the evidence. Edward Zorich testified that he was the Villa Park Police Department's lead detective in this case. When he first went to the defendant's house on Friday, March the 16th, the defendant told him that she and the victim had watched television until 10:30 p.m. on Thursday, and then they both went to bed. The next morning, the victim kissed the defendant goodbye and left for work between 7 and 7:30 a.m. The defendant told Detective Zorich that she and the victim had been living together for about 7 years, that they had a loving and committed relationship, and there was absolutely no infidelity. You telling porky pies, young lady? When Detective Zorich looked through the house and garage, he noticed that the Mustang in the garage was covered with a layer of dust, except for a spot on the trunk lid. When another officer asked for the keys to the trunk, the defendant stated that she only had ignition keys and never had a key to the trunk. Who doesn't have a key to the trunk? Detective Zorich further testified that after he spoke with a neighbor and learned that Sodaro's car and the victim's white van had been in the driveway overnight, he asked the defendant about this information. The defendant stated that Sodaro had dropped her car off in the middle of the night because she was intoxicated and that a friend of Sodaro's had driven Sodaro home. The defendant claimed to the police officer that she did not have a phone number or an address to Sodaro. Detective Zorich testified that on Saturday, March the 17th, he asked the defendant if he could do a more intensified search of the house. She initially refused, but then she said, "Okay, fine." And she further reiterated that she did not have keys to the trunk of the Mustang. Another detective, Brian Barkalow, entered the back seat of the Mustang and removed a speaker from the rear deck and saw a body in the trunk. The body was lying on its side in the fetal position. The hands were bound behind the back and there was a plastic bag over the head. There was no sign of forced entry in the garage. The record reveals that the victim's hands and feet were bound together with duct tape and that the plastic bag over the victim's head was secured with duct tape. Detective Daniel McCann testified that he was an investigator of computer crimes. Upon questioning, the defendant told him that there were 2 computers in the house. The defendant told him that she had used MySpace in 2006, but that she had stopped using it because there were too many crazy people on it. Yeah, you. Detective McCann testified that he could tell that several websites had recently been accessed from the defendant's laptop computer. These were AOL, Yahoo, MySpace, and Craigslist. Wow, those were the days, huh? Finally, Detective McCann testified that pursuant to his investigation, he learned that a roll of duct tape had been purchased at a nearby Walgreens store at 7:34 p.m. on March 15, 2007. Deputy Sheriff Brian Barkalow, a forensic investigator, testified that he found the victim's body in the trunk of the Mustang after removing a speaker. Having found the body and without divulging that information to the defendant, he went inside to ask the defendant if she had keys to the trunk of the Mustang. This is where she told him again, "I don't know, the locks had been changed so I don't have the keys." Again, who changes the locks on a car? In a search of the house that took place after the police obtained a search warrant, Deputy Barkalow found 2 sets of keys on an end table in the living room and a key and a dresser in the master bedroom. One of the keys from the living room and the key from the dresser fit the lock of the trunk. Former Deputy Sheriff Paul Dunklau testified that 3 latent fingerprints from the rear end of the Mustang were identified as coming from the defendant's left hand. DuPage crime laboratory scientist John Collins compared duct tape in the defendant's garage with the duct tape found on the bag that covered the victim's head. He testified that characteristics of the tearing patterns indicated that the tape matched one another. Officer Richard Wistocki, a computer crimes investigator, testified that MySpace messages that purported to come from Hollywood, Becky, New York Fire Department, Sam, and Tiff all originated or were part of the defendant's MySpace account. A DNA expert testified that 2 profiles of DNA were on the bandanas that were tied around the victim's eyes and mouth. The major contributor was the victim and the minor contributor was the defendant. Jennifer Cones, a fingerprint expert, testified that most of the palm prints on the plastic bag that covered the victim's head matched the defendant's palm print. Several of the defendant's fingerprints matched those taken from the bottom of the plastic bag. Dr. Scott Denton, performed an autopsy on the victim on Sunday, March 18, 2007. He said there were no outward signs of injury and there was no dirt or debris inside the plastic bag that covered the victim's head. The bag had been tied tightly enough that no air would have gone through and that the victim's death was caused by suffocation. Now, as for the defense, Dr. Muhammad Hassan, he testified on behalf of Nicole. He said that back in 2006, Nicole had arthritis. She had arthritis in her back, and the treatment included injections of steroid and anesthetics to her spine. In January 2007, she underwent surgery to palliate her pain. Even after surgery, she continued to complain of pain and numbness in her leg. She claimed that the victim was her boss and the victim was engaged at that time. Following a work-related Christmas party, the two began a lesbian relationship. Shortly thereafter, the defendant, the victim, and a third person started to rent a house together. About a year later, the defendant and the victim purchased the house together and the three lived there for about 4 or 5 years. The defendant and the victim bought the Villa Park home in May 2006. The defendant testified that in 2006 she was shot in the stomach and the exit wound left her with recurring back problems. Also, in 2006, she fell at work and injured her back again. In February 2007, she slipped on some ice. On good days, she could only lift 40 pounds and on bad days, she could not lift anything. She claimed her doctor told her, don't lift anything over 25 pounds. So you may ask, okay, she's got these back pains, but why is this relevant? Well, the defense argued, if the doctor told her, don't lift anything more than 25 pounds, and if she genuinely had problems lifting anything, then they claimed, how is she going to lift 162 pounds, the victim, and put the victim in the trunk? About a year before the victim's death, she and the victim agreed to have an open relationship. The victim wanted to have children, but the defendant did not feel ready for the responsibility. The defendant testified that she never hid her MySpace communications from the victim, and the victim was free to read them whenever she wanted to. The defendant further testified that she met Sodaro in person in February 2006. She claimed that the victim knew everything about her relationship with Sodaro. Sodaro had kissed the defendant in front of the victim at a summer party in 2006. The defendant and Sodaro did not communicate much after that, but resumed their relationship after December 31st, 2006 New Year's Eve party. The defendant had plans to meet Sodaro on March 15th, 2007. That same evening, Baldridge came over to help the victim prepare for a birthday party to be held at the house. Baldridge left around 7:15 or 7:20 p.m. After that, the victim went to Walgreens to buy duct tape. They planned to put away some of the Christmas decorations that were in the garage. As the victim packed items into plastic bins, the defendant tore off strips of duct tape for the victim to use. While they were in the garage, the defendant was texting and making plans to meet Sodaro. The victim was irritated by this because she wanted the defendant to stay and help her. When the defendant started to get ready to go out, the victim stated that she might stay at Baldridge's house that evening. When the defendant was done showering, she did not see the victim in the house and assumed that she was in the garage or over at her sister's house. The defendant left to meet Sodaro around 8:45 p.m., the bowling alley. The defendant drank beer and did some shots. Sodaro drove her home. The victim's van was in the driveway when they got home. The defendant said she was not concerned about bringing Sodaro home because the victim knew about the relationship. When they went inside, she called out to the victim to let her know that they were home. When there was no response, she assumed that the victim went to Baldridge's house. On Friday morning, the defendant woke up and began cleaning for the party. She called the victim around 10 a.m. but received no answer. Sodaro woke up around 9 or 10 a.m. and they watched television until the defendant received a call from Lola about the victim. The defendant further testified that when the police returned on March 17th, she initially refused to let them search the house again because she had spoken with her father. Her father told her, don't talk to no one, don't talk to the police, go see a lawyer. However, the police said, let us search your house. We need to try and find the victim. So she allowed this search despite her father's advice. She also testified that these fictional characters on MySpace were just a game. Sodaro knew it was a game and they both found it fun. Finally, she testified that she loved the victim and was always happy with the victim during their relationship. Now, following deliberations, the jury found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. the trial court denied the defendant's motion for a new trial. Following a sentencing hearing, the trial court sentenced the defendant to 50 years in prison. So to conclude on what actually happened, Villa Park police officers believed that Nicole killed Rebecca Klein on March the 15th, 2 days before her body was found. After Nicole allegedly suffocated Klein to death, she went out with another woman, Rose Sodaro. That night, Nicole and Sodaro went bowling in Tinley Park, then returned to Nicole's home where they engaged in sexual intercourse. Sodaro believed that Rebecca was Nicole's roommate and not her life partner. So from the manipulation of, yeah, I was a firefighter, yeah, I had this disease, no, I'm not in a relationship with this woman, she's just a friend, to this murder, it never really got revealed on the actual motivation. But based on the information that I managed to gather, I think it was just her wanting to remove her from her life, and it was easier for Nicole to murder her than just to simply walk away, which is crazy if you think about it. Anyway, these are all the interrogations, so if you can help me to open these, DM my Instagram. Thanks for watching.